Alright, hello, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we are in the midst of doing a series of Bible decodes from the New Testament, in particular the book of Luke right now, and from this book from Michael Menescotz, Menesgotz, and his new book is called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And the Flavians were the dynasty of Caesars who ruled the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. And that includes Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. And Menescotz is a proponent of the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament, along with many, many other scholars that have gone before him, especially Cliff Carrington, Henry Davis, Joseph Atwill, Roman Piso, Abelard Reuchlin, Sir Ronald Syme, James Ballantyne Hannay, and Bruno Bauer, along with a ton of authors, popular authors, that have also propagated this thesis in code, mostly, not overtly. But these authors include such luminaries as J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Edgar Allan Poe, Leo Tolstoy, William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Mary Shelley, and quite a few others that I'm not remembering. Fielding and Cervantes and Emerson. Did I say Edgar Allan Poe? Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. These people all have forwarded the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. And the general theory is that the New Testament was written in the 70s AD, or at least the Gospels in the 70s, maybe in the 80s, during the Flavian dynasty. And they backdated the story of Jesus by 30, 40, or at least 40 years. And at the same time, they wrote a history of the War of the Jews. And that was a war between the Romans and the Jews that occurred at 66 AD until 73 AD. Emperors Vespasian and Titus were both military generals in that war, and then subsequently became emperor. But the general idea is that the Romans were sick and tired of the Jews and having to fight them in war after war, insurrection after uprising, revolution after riot. And this had been going on for over 100 years. And it was because of the peculiar militancy of the Jews. They believed, most of the groups of tribes and nations that the Romans had conquered were relatively easy to absorb into their empire. Let them, worship their gods, but make them also worship Caesar. Most of them had a polytheistic structure, so that wasn't really too much to ask. But the Romans, the Jews, were monotheistic, with a jealous and zealous God. And the Jews thought that they were the chosen people. And so that made them relatively xenophobic and separatist. The jealous and zealous God also had obsessive compulsive disorder and demanded that the Jews follow all kinds of rituals throughout life. A stricture against graven images, circumcision rituals, animal sacrifice rituals, and the Passover lamb, and the kosher food laws, and these things had to be all done just so. And this was high maintenance for the Romans, because the Jews were willing to die to maintain these rituals. And so there were a lot of uprisings. There was a big uprising when Caligula, Caesar, attempted to put his statue in the Jewish temple. I think and so the Romans put together a plan. Another thing was that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. There were many biblical prophecies predicting the arrival of a Messiah. And the Messiah that they were waiting for was a military commander, somebody who was going to help the Jews rise up and overthrow the Romans, or whoever was in control of Jerusalem, or really Judea. And so the Romans tried to take advantage of all these things and write a story about a Jewish Messiah. But the Jewish Messiah that they wrote about was a Prince of Peace, and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and believed in turning the other cheek to oppression, walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, believing that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and exhorting his God to forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do. And this same Jesus, at the same time that he's being so deferential to the Romans, is out there outside the Jewish temple, overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers, who were just trading in the Roman coins that had graven images on them for the Jewish coins that did not, so that people could bring them into the temple for an offering, and upsetting the commerce of the Jews who were out there selling pigeons and doves and lambs and rams to bring them into the temple for the sacrifice. So Jesus is taking a direct hit on the rituals of the Jews while being deferential to them, almost as if he was created by the Romans. And not only that, but then you consider the facts that the New Testament was written in Greek, which is a language on the street of Rome, and all of the Roman royals spoke and read Greek as well as Latin, whereas in Judea, Greek was a rare thing for only the top rungs of the society, and the Romans had a monopoly on censorship. Nothing was published in the Roman Empire unless Caesar approved of it, and the Romans had a monopoly on publishing. They are the only group of people who had thousands of slaves they called scribes to sit around and copy stuff over and over again so that they could get a large volume of these New Testaments, or books of Mark and Matthew and Luke, out there. And to get it out there, they needed to have a postal system. And lo and behold, the Romans had the only postal system in the Roman Empire. So that circumstantial evidence is also overwhelmingly in favor of a Roman origins hypothesis. And then the method of operation. The Romans, and Titus in particular, had created other religions as well for psychological operation purposes. In this case, they created the Gospels in order to mellow out the Jews. But they created rabbinical Judaism as well. That is also a Flavian creation. And that was targeted really at the Pharisees, whereas the Gospels was really targeted at the Zealots. And they created other religions as well. So the Romans had the motive, they had the means, they had the opportunity, and they had the method. Now, what they did is they backdated the story of Jesus, and at the same time, they wrote this War of the Jews. And this showed the events of the war that both Vespasian and Titus engaged in, and both were wounded in. And so it goes through all of the events of this war, and it received a large endorsement from Titus. The author went by the name of Josephus. Josephus's War of the Jews in 7 volumes. However, if you read War of the Jews, which Christians obviously have not, because they believe that Josephus is corroborating evidence for the existence of Jesus. But if you read Josephus and you know who he is or his story, then he is very strong evidence against the existence of Jesus. Because in his history, he tells the story, in particular, of the military campaign of Titus, which lasted from 70 until 73 AD. A 3-year military campaign in Judea. And Jesus had a 3-year military campaign, a 3-year ministry in Judea in the 30s, 40 years apart. And Titus goes through a number of different events during these 3 years, goes to different places. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes, in the same order. And wherever they go, they encounter certain events or happenings that are the same. Not exactly the same, but typologically the same, or conceptually the same. The same type of thing happens to them at each one of these locations. In addition to that, Jesus makes a number of prophecies in the New Testament, and at least a dozen of those prophecies are fulfilled literally in the book of War of the Jews by Titus. He fulfills the prophecies of Jesus. Titus is the second coming of Jesus, according to War of the Jews. And people in the ancient times, they knew this. Many of them, many Christian sects, Josephus was part of their Bible. And even today, for the preterist sect, Josephus is part of their canonical Bible. Now, what Michael Menescotz does is he digs in even further to the book of Luke, and he looks for other classes of parallels. Not just the parallelism between the military campaign of Titus and the ministry of Jesus, or the second coming, prophecies fulfilled, but many other themes are also involved. And he dug into the book of Luke for a few years looking for parallels. He found over 250 just in the book of Luke. It's over 10 per chapter. I believe there's at least 6 in every single chapter. That means that the parallels are completely saturating the text of Luke. Not only that, but he charts these parallels out. Now, he presents all of the parallels in this book. He's presented many of them already on this channel, and they run the gamut. Some of them are weak, and you could easily dismiss them as coincidental when considered in isolation. But when you consider them together with 50 other parallels or 100 other parallels, then it's harder to dismiss them as coincidental. Some of them you can't dismiss them as coincidental, even just one of them, because they're so thick with parallels, where a paragraph has 10 things in common with the other parallel. And the parallels go both ways. Sometimes Jesus is parodying Josephus, and sometimes Josephus is parodying the New Testament. And many of the parallels are mean-spirited, mocking, ridiculing anybody who believes the text, and especially the Jews. It is a profoundly anti-Semitic display. And, Josephus claimed to have been a Jew who surrendered to Vespasian and then defected to the Romans and predicted that Vespasian would one day become emperor. And when Vespasian did become emperor, he pardoned Josephus, brought him to Rome as the court historian, and adopted him as a member of his family. So Josephus is known as Flavius Josephus, of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. He is the one who was supposed to have written War of the Jews. Well, anyway, Menescot's graphed these parallels out on a chart, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and Josephus on the horizontal axis. When he plotted all 250 points, or plus 250 plus points, he found that he had formed 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman royals, the Caesars, and their ilk. And those letters are A, P, T, V, S. The AP is somewhat of a mystery. Could stand for the Holy Ghost, Agion Pneuma. Could stand for Arius Piso, a shadow player in the Roman court. But we pretty much know that the TVS stands for Titus Vespasianus, as that was used as an imprint on Roman coins at that time. So not only did the Romans write the book of Luke, they literally signed their name to it. They wanted to be discovered for having written it at a certain point, probably after their lifetimes, but eventually, and I doubt that they thought it was going to take 2,000 years before it was decoded. Okay, now we're reading from Menescot's here. He's talking about statistics mainly, like the odds against the fact that 250 parallels would create 5 Latin letters. I think he doesn't even need to do this because the odds are so slim that something like that would be coincidental. But he goes through the process anyway, and he's done most of the work, but I think he's going to sum it up here. The first step to assessing the probability is to draw the APTVS pattern and calculate how much of the chart area it fills. This is shown here below with these 2 parallels. Okay. In doing this, I ignored the anomalous diagonal line between the T and the V, which mainly involves Jesus parodying Titus. because those parallels were there to convince the mid-level rank of the secrecy cult that Titus is the second coming of Jesus and is not part of the APTVS pattern and its 5 Latin letters. So this that seems kind of an odd omission. But I suppose I can see it. Makes some sense. Okay, coloring it in Excel enabled me to measure the area that I had colored in, which turned out to be 24% of the chart area. To be conservative, let's call it 25. If all of the parallels that Cliff Carrington had identified had been located in one small region of the chart, then a critic could argue that this makes alignment with the APTVS pattern far more likely. However, Cliff's parallels are spread out almost most of the chart area. Don't quite get that. We can therefore move on to calculate the odds that at least 18 out of 25 unintentional and thus randomly positioned parallels would align with a region that fills a quarter of the chart area. Now he's done something like this already, but this is easily calculated. The odds of at least 18 successes out of 25 tries, with each having a 1 in 4 chance, turns out to be very close to 1 in a million. That said, I suppose some critics might argue that we should ignore all of Carrington's parallels that rely on the text found in Antiquities of the Jews. This would leave us with 11 out of 14 parallels being a precise match, but the odds of at least 11 out of 14 being matched are still 1 in 25,000. So whichever approach you prefer, the pattern of parallels that Cliff Carrington independently identified is highly correlated with the APTVS pattern that I have painstakingly identified to an extent that could not reasonably be judged to be coincidence. Now, he's throwing that together with also having calculated the odds of 250 out of 400 parallels that he found fitting into the pattern. And those odds are staggering. I believe the number he came up with was like 10 to the 56th. 1 in 10 to the 56th. So that's 100 billion, 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 billion. In summary, this offers strong independent confirmation that the APTVS pattern is genuine, and together with my initial analysis, just looking at the odds of 250 out of 400 parallels aligning with the APTVS pattern, this provides 2 different ways to confirm that the APTVS pattern is genuine. Okay. Time to flip over to a new page. Hopefully I've done this correctly. I really haven't. It seems like I'm skipping a page. I skipped 2 pages. Let me grab the book itself. Generally, I read it off of photographs of the book because the text of the book is so tiny that it is very difficult to read. So I normally take photographs of the book and read it from there, but it looks like I skipped a couple pages, so see if we can find page 140 and start from there. Okay, this is starting chapter 17, using links with Exodus 12 to show that the parallels are intentional. Now this is a different theme of parallels that he found. where both War of the Jews and the New Testament, the Gospel of Luke, are both parodying Exodus 12, which Exodus 12 is the part of Exodus where the Passover lamb ritual is gone over, like all the rules, that the lamb needs to be not blemished and that you can't break its legs and all of that. And so he's I think doing a statistical analysis of that particular set of rituals, of parallels. In the previous two chapters, I showed that. Okay, let's. Sorry, let me see if I can get a light here on this subject. Yeah. Okay, I might be able to read it now. In the previous two chapters, I showed that the APTVS pattern has such fine details that for it to be a biased selection requires at least 2,000 parallels, filling Luke 4 times, because Luke only has 1,150 verses. It is astronomically improbable that 250 plus noteworthy parallels would form a meaningful and so clearly intentional seeming pattern, unless you suppose such a large number of them exist that Luke contains nothing else. Carrington's independently discovered parallels are too strongly correlated with the APTVS pattern identified to explain away as coincidence. In this chapter, I will use the links with Exodus 12 to provide a further confirmation that the APTVS pattern is genuine, that it was intentional, and that both stories, Luke and Jewish War, were edited to create it. As you may recall from earlier, both Jesus' story in Luke and the text of Jewish War discussing the famine in Jerusalem offer subtle metaphors for each of the required acts of the Passover ritual, as set out in the Old Testament at Exodus 12. I found 40 examples of this, and at least 21 of them there seems to be no doubt what bit of text is evoking the relevant step in Exodus 12. Unlike with some of the parallels forming the rest of the APTVS pattern, there is no subjective judgment call to be made. This clear-cut nature is what makes them especially useful for statistical analysis. These 21 examples were listed earlier in chapter 10, but I'll repeat a few examples here to illustrate how non-subjective they are. In each case, there is a straightforward location to be identified in each story and no room to argue about it. Exodus 12 says the sacrifice must be prepared with hyssop. We find this in Jewish War in the famine when Mary cooks her baby, who is descended from the house of hyssop. Luke describes a stalk of hyssop being proffered for Jesus to drink from on the cross. Exodus 12 describes the animal sacrifice as a meal to be eaten. In Jewish War, in the famine in Jerusalem, this is mirrored by Mary eating her baby and declaring him a sacrifice. In Luke, this is mentioned where Jesus declares that his body is given for you to eat of my flesh. Exodus 12 says the sacrifice meal must involve unleavened bread, meaning unrisen. In Jewish War, the description of Jerusalem's famine takes time to mention that they were so hungry they snatched the bread out of the oven half-baked, a subtle way of saying unrisen. In Luke, we have unleavened bread at Passover mentioned in Jesus' Last Supper. Exodus 12 also says you must not break the bones of the lamb sacrifice killed for the Passover ritual. Luke 23:33 through 53 describes Jesus' being taken down from the cross. The Gospel of John is the one that states that Jesus is the Lamb of God, and in chapter 19, verses 30 to 36, it contributes further detail to the story, saying that the Jews proposed to break Jesus' legs, but after the Romans broke the legs of the other two men, they decided against breaking Jesus' legs so that the scripture should be fulfilled. Less obvious, but nonetheless clear when inspected, is the description of a Jesus being whipped to the bone alongside many other violent acts, all of which fail to involve breaking of bones. Exodus 12 says you must strike the blood of the lamb on the vertical and horizontal wooden posts of your front door. Jewish war describes that in Jerusalem's famine there were thieves who were drunk, implying wine, which in Christianity is a metaphor for Jesus' blood, who went bashing into the door frames of people's houses. In Luke, Jesus' being nailed to the cross unarguably must leave blood on vertical and horizontal wooden posts, and so on. The point is that for each of the required acts in the Passover ritual of Exodus 12, Luke evokes this in one or two specific locations, and Jewish war's description of the famine also evokes this in one or sometimes two locations, and in each case there is no real subjectivity about it. It is plainly obvious which paragraph or verse evokes each concept from Exodus 12. This gives rise to 21 unambiguous parallels involving Luke and descriptions of famine in Jewish war, whose locations we can readily plot on the chart, and each one provides a dot that is a precise match with the APTVS pattern. Okay, I think we're going to stop there and start up. The next is step 1, the odds that both stories evoke each of the 21 Exodus 12 concepts in at least once and at most twice. So he's going to be looking at the odds of these things happening tomorrow. So hope you come back and check that out. Meanwhile, you can like, share, and subscribe, comment as you see fit, and hope you have a beautiful